Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Damn Canada by me, Dee Dee. If you are new here, hi, hello, and welcome. It is great to have you. Here on Damn Canada, I like to cover all the lesser known murder, mystery, and mayhem cases that go on here in Canada and Canada only. So if that's something that you're interested in, I hope I see you again in the future. So last year in late September, the Couldnt mine near Sudbury, Ontario had an accident happen where the elevator that brings the miners up and down through the mine was damaged. 39 miners were stuck between 900 to 1220 meters down underground for a few days while they waited for rescue. Eventually, a ladder system was put in place and they had to climb up through this ladder while taking breaks periodically, which I heard was absolutely exhausting. Luckily, everyone got out safely and nobody was harmed. Now, mining is a lot safer than it was way back in the day, but this little incident had me thinking, what are some of the worst mining disasters to happen in Canada? And with Canada having one of the biggest mining industries in all of the world, there was plenty to choose from. So today I picked 3 that really caught my attention, and I am going to tell you guys all about them. Here are some of the worst mining disasters, specifically coal mining disasters, to have taken place in Canada. When you hear the term mining disaster, it probably conjures up images of explosions or mines collapsing, but not all mining disasters are caused from something happening inside of the mine. In the mining town of Frank, Alberta, on April 29th, 1903, there were about 20 miners working the night shift. In the early hours of April 29th, a freight train pulled out of the mine and was slowly making its way towards town when the crew heard a deafening rumble coming from behind them. The engineer instinctively set the throttle full speed ahead and sped the train across the Crow's Nest River and to safety. They weren't sure what they were running from in that exact moment, but it wouldn't take long for them to figure it out. With the rumbling catching the attention of some of the town folk, anyone that was awake looked towards Turtle Mountain because that's where it seemed the rumbling was coming from. And at 4:10 a.m., they witnessed the peak of Turtle Mountain breaking off and 110 million tons of rock and mud catapulted towards the sleeping town below. The massive amount of rocks sped towards the town at an estimated 112 kilometers an hour. Onlookers said it only took about 100 seconds for all of it to reach the opposing hills, destroying the east side of Frank, the Pacific Railway line, and the coal mine, and with the sound being heard from over 200 kilometers away. The rock slide was more than 30 meters deep, with some areas reaching 45 meters, and it spread across the land 30 kilometers wide, and some of the rocks were the size of cars or bigger. Out of the 20 miners working, 3 were actually standing outside of the mine when the landslide happened, and they were all killed instantly, and the other 17 were trapped underground with no exit. Now, the miners down in the tunnels didn't know what exactly had happened at that moment, but discovering that the entrance to the mine had been blocked with rocks and debris, they knew that they had to start thinking quickly. Since the airflow was now being blocked, that meant that also rising levels of methane gas, which was given off by the coal seams. Along with the entrance being blocked, they were soon surprised to find that water was coming in from the nearby river. They didn't know this at the time, but the rockslide had actually damaged the Crow's Nest River and it was starting to overflow. With all of this going on so suddenly, the miners were in disbelief trying to rationalize what the heck was going on. They obviously immediately tried to start digging themselves out from the entrance, but they realized that this was a hopeless effort because there was just so much rock and debris, and they really didn't know how long they would have to dig or try to dig through all of it. One miner brought it up that he knew of a coal seam that actually reached all the way to the surface, and so with really no other options, they decided to give this coal seam a go. In pairs of 3, they dug a narrow tunnel through that coal seam for hours and hours. And as they dug, the air became increasingly toxic from the methane gas. One by one, the miners lost the energy to continue, and by the time that they reached the surface, only 3 miners were still digging. But finally, they broke through the surface with a burst of determination, only to be met with falling rocks and debris from above. They could not escape this way. It was just way too dangerous. But this realization didn't crush the miners' spirits. It actually motivated them by the fact that they actually reached the surface. And so they began to dig a separate tunnel that would pop out under an outcropping of rocks that would protect them from any of the falling debris from overhead. And after 13 strenuous hours of digging, they finally made it out. The 17 miners stood on the ground that they were once buried under and looked out onto the devastation that rocked their community. They finally understood what exactly had happened. Their once beautiful landscape was now completely deformed with a sea of rocks and mud. As the men walked down the rocks and through the disaster and towards the entrance of the mine, they came across the day shift who were actually digging at the entrance of the mine, trying to get to their fellow miners. They thought that they were still buried down there. I bet it was quite a shock to be just hopelessly digging, trying to save your fellow workers, only to turn around and have them right behind you. Okay, I apologize if the camera looks slightly different now. I just booted it across the room. I don't know where I was. Let's just continue. As the survivors made their way towards town, they would be met with all forms of tragedy. Some miners would lose their homes, and some of the miners would even lose their entire families. One 15-year-old, whose name was Lillian Clark, was working at the mine with her father that night, and she had already anticipated that her father had passed since he was one of the 3 men that were standing outside of the mine when the landslide happened. But sadly, she also lost her mother and her 6 siblings who were at home at the time of the landslide and were buried alive. The rock slide was actually never cleaned up, and so now it is obviously a burial site and a memorial site for all of the lives lost in the Frank Slide. There's also a Frank Slide Interactive Center that people can go to, and the site is now a designated historical site of Alberta. It is estimated that between 70 to 90 people were buried alive during the slide, but some speculate that that number is quite higher due to the fact that there were drifters in the area at the time, and some even speculate that the number of drifters was in the 50s. And so because the Frank Slide was never cleaned up, we actually don't have an exact body count as to how many people did lose their lives. The railway and the mine would be quickly reopened in the coming weeks, but in 1911, the townspeople were relocated due to the fears of another landslide taking place. The mountain is considered unstable, and it actually moves around 1 centimeter a year, which is a lot. And the mountain is referred to as slow-moving mountain, or the mountain that moves slowly by the indigenous peoples. Then later in 1917, the mine was officially closed. One of the 17 miners that survived the landslide was named Charles Ellick. He didn't waste any time going back to work in the mines like many of the other miners. And after the townspeople were all relocated in 1911, he went to work at the Hillcrest mine, which wasn't far from Frank. On Friday, June 19th, 1914, Charles Ellick, who was now a father of 4, was getting ready to head off to work at the mines like he did most days. The mine was actually closed the past 2 days due to overproduction, and so he got to spend some good quality time at home before he went back to work on that Friday. He kissed his pregnant wife Julia goodbye and then headed off to work at Hillcrest Mine to his morning shift that started at 7 a.m. Back at the mine, fire boss William Adkin was doing his routine mine inspection, and he noted that there was low levels of methane gas along with some cave-ins in some various areas. Now, hearing that methane gas was present may sound alarming to someone who is unfamiliar with mining, but in coal mines, there's almost always a small amount of methane gas found because it is emitted from coal seams. For it to explode, however, it needs to be above a 5% level and less than 14%, which is one of the reasons why a good ventilation system is needed. And coal dust itself is highly explosive, but it could be kept in check as long as there was enough moisture levels in the air to dampen it down. And so even though there was low levels of methane gas found that morning, when the moisture level was taken, it was considered adequate, and so there really wasn't any concern for the day. Charles Ellick arrived to the lamp house to check in for his shift, and he walked by William Adkins' posted up notice of the methane gas and the various areas of the cave-ins. Charles walked up to the board that held everyone's brass tags, and he took his 2 brass tags that were used to identify him. He walked over to the timekeeper and gave him one of the 2 brass tags. The timekeeper took that 1 brass tag from Charles and took it and hung it up on the board behind him, indicating that Charles was now checked in for his shift. Charles kept the other brass tag on himself, and this system was in place to keep track of how long the miners worked, as well as make sure that everyone came out of the mine safely at the end of their shift. If there was 2 brass tags from each miner at the end of the shift, all was good. Charles walked over to mine number 1 and entered into the first of 2 mines at Hillcrest and got to work working just like any other day. Now, how Hillcrest worked was there was actually 2 main mines. Mine number 1 had a 365 meter slant, and mine number 2 actually went down 730 meters. And then the 2 mines were linked by tunnels underground. Charles and the rest of the miners were hard at work for the next 2 hours, while Fireboss Sam Charlton laid charges throughout Old Level 1 to expand the mine forward. Around 7:30 a.m., as Sam was getting ready to set off the charges, a huge gas explosion went off right beside him, throwing his body like a rag doll and killing him instantly. This explosion stirred up the coal dust in the mine and spontaneously triggered a second and an assumed 3rd explosion. The force of the multiple explosions blasted through the tunnel system, killing anybody in its path. The explosion collapsed Mine 1, which was closest to the blast, making it impossible for any survivors to escape that way. Mine number 2 was damaged, but since it was farther away from the explosion, it didn't completely collapse. Survivors, of course, tried to escape, but after 15 long, agonizing minutes, only 19 had gotten out. And with that, a whole new terror came: the afterdamp. Afterdamp is an extremely toxic mixture of gas that is rich with carbon monoxide. This gas is left in the air after an explosion or a fire in a mine. It is extremely toxic, and at a concentration level of 13%, it would cause unconsciousness and eventually death. After the explosion at Hillcrest, the levels were at an estimated 50%. The miners already on the surface knew that the afterdamp could kill any of the survivors trapped below. They rushed over to the intake fan at mine number 2 to make sure it was still working, since the exhaust fan at mine number 1 had been damaged. And right after that, they got working on the hoist system. The hoist engine had actually been buried under big slabs of cement, and so the miners had to pry away these large chunks with their bare hands. But luckily, once they did, the engine was still operable. They also got to work on clearing the track into mine number 1 and finding a working mine cart. They managed to do all of this within 15 minutes. When I say they didn't waste any time, I mean not even a millisecond. One engineer had escaped out of mine number 2, and within minutes he joined the first rescue team and entered back into the mine. The rescue team got to the junction of level 1 north and level 1 south, and that's where they located their first 3 survivors. And once oxygen masks and help came from the nearby towns, former fire boss Harry White was given the grim task of being the first to enter the small hole into mine number 1 and explore the destroyed area. He squeezed himself through this tiny hole in mine 1 and dropped down into slant 1, which was the worst part of the mine where the destruction had been. The initial thought was that Sam Charlton had actually done something wrong to cause the explosion, since he had been getting ready to set off the laid charges. But when Harry came across Sam's body, he found that the firing cable was still wrapped around Sam's arm, therefore meaning that Sam never even had the chance to set off the laid charges. With this information, they came to the conclusion that the explosion was due to the methane gas and was most likely ignited by a spark from either a lamp flare, an electrical short, or even just a falling rock. As survivors escaped out of the mines, many of them would turn around to run right back in to help save their fellow miners. One man was found unconscious due to the afterdamp in the mine, and it took the rescue team 3 hours to revive him. And the very next day, he went right back to the mine and joined the rescue team. These miners were heroic as fuck. Another man named David Murray had survived the blast and stumbled out of the mine alive, but when he got outside, he realized that his 3 sons were still back inside of the mine, and so he turned around and tried to run right back in. The people around tried to hold him back and tried to fight with him to try and get him to stay outside where it was safe, but he wasn't having any of it, and he broke away from everyone and ran right back into the mine to save his sons. Unfortunately, David would be overcome by the gas, and his body would be later found not too far away from the body of his 3 sons. As the rescue team worked tirelessly, coal cars would slowly rise to the surface with charred and suffocated bodies. The death count soon greatly surpassed the amount of survivors. The scene outside of the mine was absolute chaos, if you can only imagine. Women and children wandered around aimlessly, trying to understand the absolute devastation that surrounded them. And by Saturday afternoon, 162 bodies had been seen by the coroner. By the end of it all, out of the 235 men that went to work that morning, only 65 came out alive. Unfortunately, Charles Ellick was one of the men to die in the blast, leaving behind 4 children and a pregnant wife. And along with the loss of Charles, the family was rained on by bad luck. A really bad storm had come through the next day, which caused a tree to fall on the Ellick's home and caused extreme damage. Then, later on that afternoon, Julia gave birth to their son. Charles's 5th child was born the day after his death. Julia was now left a widow with a destroyed home, literally, and 5 children to take care of, all in the span of 24 hours. Of course, Julia was not the only widow, however, and 130 women were left widowed, with an estimated 400 children being left fatherless. This disaster also took place on payday, and instead of the families of the deceased receiving their checks, the money actually went into a trust, leaving the families with nothing. Due to the lack of labor laws and legislation at the time, the families of the victims had no other choice but to sue the company Hillcrest Collieries to seek compensation. Unfortunately, this didn't work out that well, with only some of the families receiving $1,800 and those families having to wait over a year to receive that money. With no money right after this horrible disaster, the women had to do what they could to get by. Some would take in washing or open boarding houses or do other things to bring in cash. Some would even remarry to complete strangers to make sure their families were taken care of. Luckily, the community really did come together to help one another through this horrible time. Women from the surrounding towns would often bring food or lend a hand wherever they could to the people of Hillcrest. With 189 men losing their lives to the Hillcrest explosion, this was the worst coal mine disaster to have taken place in Canadian history. But unfortunately, World War I started just 7 weeks after the explosion, which in turn greatly overshadowed the whole incident. The Hillcrest explosion is one of the major mining disasters to have taken place in Alberta, with the Frank Slide being another one of them. The people who lost their lives in the Hillcrest explosion were buried in a mass grave, which is now a memorial site for the many lives lost on that dreadful Friday morning. In the 1950s, Springhill's No. 2 colliery was the deepest coal mine in the whole world, with sloping shafts reaching 4,300 meters underground, or 14,200 feet. For some of the miners, going to work underground in this mine was the farthest they had ever been from home. With this mine being so deep, many of the concerns that came with working in the mines was heightened, and one of those concerns was something called a bump. A bump is an underground seismic event, or in universal terms, an underground earthquake, which is caused by shifts and disturbances in the ground around the mine. When miners are mining, the weight of the mine is being distributed differently as they go. Sometimes that weight distribution shifts, causing a bump. Now, these bumps could just be little rumbles, or it could be a huge, massive bump that buckles an entire tunnel and smashes the ground right up to the ceiling, destroying everything in its path. Due to the increased risk of a bump occurring the farther down they went into the earth, the way in which the mining job was done was revised about 20 years prior to 1958. And I'm not going to get into the whole logistics of everything, but in my understanding, the old way in which they would mine was that they would dig farther and farther while leaving pillars up in the tunnel to support the structure of it, to avoid it collapsing in on itself. But the new way that they had switched to about 20 years prior was that they would dig and mine what they needed to out of that shaft or tunnel. And then they would retreat and start in a new area, letting that tunnel collapse in on itself, which the experts believed that this new way of mining would prevent a massive bump from happening. I really hope I explained that properly. If I messed that up or that was wrong in any way, please let me know in the description down below. Now, even though experts had theorized that this system would work far better than the previous, many of the old-time miners who knew the way of working underground had many reservations about this. And it was said that many of the miners that worked at the number 2 colliery would carry a sense of dread with them every single shift. And many of them really didn't like going to work at mine number 2. This feeling of dread and uneasiness wasn't unprovoked, though. Almost 2 years prior, on November 1st of 1956, at the number 4 mine at Springhill, a huge explosion took place after a cart full of coal had derailed and fell down the slope of the mine and crashed into an electrical cable. 118 men were killed in this disaster, and with the second anniversary coming up, the miners working at number 2 mine had that memory in the back of their heads. On October 23rd of 1958, the evening shift was working away when around 7 p.m. a small bump occurred. This small bump wasn't really any concern. On the contrary, the small bumps were actually welcomed since they relieved some of the built-up pressure, therefore decreasing the chance of a massive bump taking place. So the miners went about their work as they usually did, not paying any mind to the small bump. They were telling jokes, talking away, just trying not to have any of the fears that were constantly on their minds come forward and cause them stress. But at 8:06 p.m., their worst fears would come true. A massive bump burst through the mine, taking the cement ground and flattening it to the roof, throwing machinery and crushing everything and everyone in its path. This explosive bump sent 3 large shockwaves through the mine and across the town of Springhill. With the townspeople getting rocked the way they did, that familiar feeling of dread and fear rushed over them. They all knew immediately that something terrible had happened at the mines again. The whole town immediately shut down and rushed to the mines so fast that the emergency whistle was actually never set off to warn the townspeople. They were already all there. Now, unlike with gas explosions, bumps don't cause afterdamp, and so most of the rescue team were headed into the mines barefaced, even though there were dragermen there, which is the term used for the men that have the crazy breathing apparatuses. The first rescue team of miners ran into mine number 2 at Springhill and began their rescue efforts. At the 12,600 foot level and the 13,000 foot level, the rubble and gas had closed off access to the tunnels. The rescuers noted this and then continued on down the mine. They reached the 13,400 foot level, and that's when they came across their first set of survivors who were limping and walking slowly to the surface. They asked them if they needed anything, and they all just shook their heads. The only expression you could see through their coal-covered faces was pure shock. As the rescue team continued down and the survivors walked up, one of the surviving miners turned around and called out to the rescue team that it was really bad farther down below. And when a miner tells you this, you know it's going to be worse than anything you could possibly imagine. The rescue team traveled farther down into the earth, and at the 13,800 foot level, they found that the ceiling had collapsed and that there was an increased concentration of toxic gas. It was always listed as toxic gas, but I am assuming that it was methane gas. Blood was slowly starting to seep out of the mountain of rocks, and the team knew that there was no life left for the people in the rubble. And so the rescue team marked the pile of rubble with chalk in order to indicate body removal later on. And then they continued on their way. All of this rubble was very hard to get through, and even though there were draggermen there, the barefaced men would be the ones who would have to crawl and squeeze through the tiny holes in the rubble to continue on the rescuing efforts. The draggermen just would not fit with all of their gear on. The rescue team came across some miners that were trapped behind some rubble and some machinery. But on top of that, the survivors were actually becoming delirious due to being trapped in that confined space with the toxic gas. The surviving men that were trapped started to become enraged and were actually trying to fight off the rescue team. One man was kicking and screaming so much that the doctor that was with the rescue team actually had to tranquilize that man. And after that happened, it seemed that everyone else kind of settled down and they all left relatively without a fight. In the early hours of the next morning, around 4 a.m. on October 24th, there was a total of 75 survivors that had made it to the surface. Also by the next morning, the disaster that was unfolding at Springhill was making international news. And with it becoming international news, it also became the first ever major international event to appear in a live TV broadcast on CBC. And just for a side note, I will have this broadcast linked below because I do find it slightly entertaining to watch these news anchors kind of navigate a live broadcast for the first time in this day and age where everything can go live just like that. Now, the news that was being reported was extremely grim, with them reporting things like there was no possible hope of getting anyone out alive, or that all of the miners that were down there were already dead. But the old-time miners knew better than anyone that there was for sure still survivors down in the mine, and they couldn't just give up their rescue efforts yet. And thanks to these old-timers pushing extremely hard for everyone to be located, the efforts pushed on for the next week, although much more slowly. Now that all the easy to spot survivors were found, it was time to start clearing away the debris from the blocked tunnels. And this would be no easy task. Areas of the mine that once had a 12-foot clearance were now completely smashed flat together. And with that much debris to be cleared, it couldn't just be pushed off to the side. It had to be all carried out. And along with that, timber had to be brought in to reinforce the new tunnels that would be made. And to top all of that off, the trolley rails were destroyed, and so all of the carrying of rubble and timber had to be done by hand from 13,000 feet underground. And just to give a little perspective as to how deep this mine really is, when it was functional, it took the miners a 1-hour trolley ride just to reach the bottom. As they dug through the rubble, of course, they would unearth bodies of the crushed men. The smell from the bodies was unlike anything else you could possibly imagine. The farther down they went, the hotter it got, and therefore the bodies were decomposing at a much faster rate. In order to preserve the bodies found so that they could be positively identified, they would be put into airtight coffins right there immediately at the bottom of the mine and then brought up to the surface. Once brought up to the surface and with medical professionals, 3 people had to agree on the identity of the body: a mining official, a miners' union official, and a doctor. Once all 3 agreed on the identity, the family's minister or priest would then be notified, and then in turn he would notify the family. Once all 3 agreed on the identity, the media was always the last to know of any identity of anyone passed. Around October 29th, so 6 days after the bump, At the 13,000-foot level, a rescue team had come up to a 160-foot wall of debris, and it was next to impossible to clear a path through it. And so they started to dig a new tunnel around the fallen debris. A man named Blair Phillip was taking an air sample test from a broken air pipe when all of a sudden he heard a distant voice call out to him. "There are 12 of us here." Goosebumps rose across Blair's entire body, and he called back to the survivors, letting them know that they had been heard. The voice who had called out was that of Morley Kempt, and he had seen the light of Blair's lamp through the broken pipe. Now that they knew that there was men alive behind this 160-foot wall of debris, the rescue tunnel was dug a little bit faster. But they did still have a lot to dig, and so for the next 24 hours, the rescuers sent through water and soup through that broken pipe to the surviving men, who had barely eaten or drank anything in almost a week. The next morning, on October 30th at 2:25 a.m., the miners broke through to the other side of the blocked-off tunnel, and the 12 men were finally free. Finding these 12 men was a rare find for it being a week after the bump took place, but just 2 days later, they would stumble upon another remarkable discovery. On November 1st, the second anniversary of the Springhill explosion, another group of miners were found. While the rescuers were doing their work, they found one man stuck in a very tight and awkward position. He was barely breathing, severely dehydrated, and even though he was in a semi-coma, his eyes were wide open as if they were permanently stuck that way. They rescued this man and took him to the hospital and pushed onward with their rescue efforts, and that's when they came across 6 more survivors. It's been highly noted that the survivor, Maurice Ruddick, said to the rescue team upon being found that, "Give me a glass of water and I'll sing you a song," in a good-spirited voice. Maurice was praised by the other survivors with him that if it wasn't for Maurice, they probably wouldn't have made it out alive. Maurice took it upon himself to make sure that the men stayed in good spirits as they possibly could. He would sing songs to them in his amazing voice and entertain them all. And although Maurice said he would break down and cry every so often, he would make sure that none of the other men would hear him in order to not bring them down. Maurice would later on gain the title as the singing miner after the whole ordeal. For being trapped underground in the pitch dark since October 23rd, they were all in relatively fair shape. But unfortunately, the rescue team was just a few days too late for one more of the men that were with the group. Percy Rector had been stuck with his arm crushed by a pack, and even though the group tried to take him out, his arm was just way too stuck. He managed to live until October 28th, but unfortunately he would pass due to his injuries. When the rescue team's lights lit up the space that they had been trapped in, it also lit up Percy's body. And up until that point, the group had been in complete darkness. And so they didn't see Percy or anything that was around them. Seeing the body of their deceased friend really upset the men, of course. And some of them got very angry with them yelling to the rescuers to turn that shit off before they lose their minds. Now, the media outside of the mine were going absolute batshit crazy. They all wanted to have the first interview with the survivors, of course. And as one man came out of the mines named Douglas Jukes, he was asked what he wanted the most while he was down there. And Douglas Jukes replied back with a 7-Up. This answer caught the attention of the 7-Up company, and apparently they hired Douglas as a spokesperson later on. Although I wasn't able to find a ton of information, this statement has always been in the history of the Springhill bump. And once these survivors were found, they were the last. The rest of the rescue mission was for the retrieval of bodies, and on November 6th, the last victim of the devastating bump was brought up from the mine, with his widow waiting for him at the entrance like she had done since October 23rd. On November 12th, it was announced that the Springhill Colliery Number 2 would not be reopened. Out of the 174 miners that were working during the time of the bump, 75 would die and 99 would survive. The insane media coverage of the whole event caught the attention of Governor Marvin Griffin of Georgia in the United States. He thought that this would be a great publicity moment, and so he decided to invite the 19 of the surviving men. I'm assuming the last 19 that were found. He invited the 19 men and their wives on a week-long, all-expenses-paid holiday to a resort on Jekyll Island, which at the time mostly hosted millionaires and apparently was the most luxurious resort in all of Georgia. However, after Governor Marvin Griffin made the invitation, he got some news, and apparently this was very shocking for him. One of the surviving men was a black man. Please sense my sarcasm. Maurice Ruddick was one of the handful of black men who were working for Springhill at the time, and at the time of the bump, he was the only black man on duty. Now, since this invitation was to the Deep South in 1958, there were strict segregation laws that became an issue. Governor Marvin Griffin revised his invitation and said that the group could come, but that Maurice and his family would have to be segregated from the group. They would be placed in a trailer outside of the resort, and they would also have to use a separate beach. Now, at first, Maurice was like, fuck it, I don't need to go anyways. And he figured that it would be a lot easier if the white miners just went on their own and enjoyed their vacation. But his fellow miners were not having any of it, and they refused to go without Maurice. And so Maurice, always being a people pleaser, accepted the invitation with the segregation rules, just to ensure that his friends wouldn't miss out. He also hoped that maybe this would be a chance to open some people's eyes to these issues, and it did. When they all got to Georgia, all of the white miners and their families went to the fancy millionaire resort, while Maurice and his family went to a trailer park that was specifically set up just for them. Governor Marvin Griffin wanted to make sure that he didn't look like a complete and total jackass, and so he had another trailer set up with Maurice's trailer so that they would have a maid and a cook on hand, and he even set up a third trailer that had a signed company for the family. He even went as far as to set up electricity, septic tanks, put down sod, and beach chairs, all outside and away from his fellow co-workers that he was around all the time back in Nova Scotia. Common sense just went right over this guy. But the black community did what the governor wouldn't do for Maurice and his family, and they all came together and they put on shows and sang and danced and entertained Maurice and his family. And they had an amazing time. And the community also raised $100 for his family. When Maurice was asked how it felt to be segregated from his fellow coworkers, he simply said with a smile, "I seem to be enjoying myself just as much as the others." He was so humble. Maurice also sang at an event for the miners, and his performance was actually labeled something very unfortunate. I'll have it on the screen, but I don't feel comfortable repeating it. And for Maurice's performance, he actually sang "Aren't You Sorry Now?" which seemed to be a nice dig at the governor. Back in Canada in early 1959, Maurice the singing miner was voted Canadian Citizen of the Year of 1958, and out of 21 nominees, he got 51% of the vote. A few years later, in 1961, the Springhill mine disaster of 1958 would actually be featured in a Disney animated film. Can you guess which one? It was 101 Dalmatians. After the puppies are stolen, there's an image of the newspaper front page, and it reads 15 puppies are dog-napped from home. And underneath that, there's actually an account of the 1958 bump at Springhill. And I just thought that was so cool, I had to add it into this video. And that is all I have for you guys today. I found this video really fun to make. If you guys found this video entertaining, give me a thumbs up. Let me know. That really helps me out. And if you want to see more of me, why don't you hit that subscribe button? I know you want to.
So just do it! Just do it! Just do it!
Anyways, have a wonderful rest of your week, and I hope I see you in the near future. Toodaloo. Bye. Okay. Shit. I kicked my whole stand over, and luckily nothing's broken. I have no clue where I left off.